In the dead of winter, a storm swallowed the mountains, and in its silence, a child vanished. No one knew where she'd gone, no one, except a golden retriever with eyes full of fire and a past of his own. As time ran out and the snow fell harder, one war-scarred man and one relentless dog would defy the odds not just to rescue a little girl, but to reclaim their own shattered hope. Because sometimes salvation wears a collar and leaves paw prints in the snow. The town of Aspen Creek, nestled at the foot of Montana's snow-draped mountains, was enduring one of the harshest winters in decades. Snow had fallen relentlessly for 3 days, blanketing the log cabins, frozen pine trees, and empty streets in a heavy, blinding white. The air was sharp and bitter, the kind that clawed at your skin and stung your lungs with every breath. The wind howled like a restless spirit through the narrow forest trails. Through the thick curtain of falling snow, a lone figure trudged forward, a golden retriever named Bailey. He was 3 years old, with a lush honey-colored coat, now matted with ice and flakes. His dark eyes, gentle but determined, scanned the white horizon. Despite the freezing wind and layers of snow clinging to his fur, Bailey pressed on, driven by a sense of purpose he couldn't quite explain. His gait, though slowed by the snow, was steady, and his ears flicked with every distant sound. There was something ahead, something important. Bailey had no collar, no leash, and no clear home. But he wasn't a stray. He had once belonged to an elderly couple who owned a cabin at the edge of Aspen Creek. When they passed within months of each other the previous spring, Bailey had refused to leave the land. Locals would sometimes see him pacing the tree lines, watching. Some said he was waiting. Others thought he had simply gone wild. But there was something about the dog, something watchful, almost sacred. On this particular evening, as the wind moaned through the evergreens and the snowdrifts grew waist-deep, Bailey's ears perked. He paused, nose twitching. Beneath the storm, a new scent had emerged, faint but sharp. Human. Child. He followed it, veering off the main trail into the deeper woods, his paws sinking but unwavering. After several minutes through the veil of snow and branches, he saw her. A small shape curled up beneath a fallen log, barely visible against the white. Her coat was powder blue, too thin for the weather, her knit hat pulled low over golden curls that peeked out from beneath. Her face, flushed and streaked with tears, was pinched from the cold. Her lips moved, murmuring something unintelligible. Her name was Emily Carter, 7 years old. She had wide gray eyes that flickered between fear and hope, and a thin bird-like frame that trembled violently in the snow. She had set out that morning from the trailer park on the southern edge of Aspen Creek, trying to find her mother. Sarah Carter, Emily's mom, had been seen stumbling out of Mason's bar the night before, too drunk to drive, too proud to call for help. She hadn't come home. Emily had waited first with worry, then dread, and when the snow began to fall again, she pulled on her coat and boots and slipped out the door. Bailey crept forward carefully, his head low, his movements slow and unthreatening. Emily turned her head, her eyes growing wide at the sight of the dog. For a moment she seemed unsure whether to cry or call out. Bailey stopped a few feet away and sat down, his breath misting in the cold air. He wagged his tail once slowly as if to say, "I see you." Emily blinked. "Are you real?" she whispered. Bailey tilted his head ears, perking at her voice. Then, in one fluid motion, he stepped closer and nudged her boot gently with his nose. Emily reached out a trembling hand and touched the top of his head. He was real. And warm. Bailey circled around and pressed his body against her side, sharing his heat. Emily curled closer, her tears falling freely now. She whispered again, almost inaudibly, "I don't know what to do. I can't find her. I think I'm lost." Bailey didn't answer, of course, but he stood, looked back in the direction he had come, then turned his head to her. He took a step, then another, then stopped and looked at her again. Emily hesitated, her limbs stiff from cold, but she understood. She stood slowly wobbling. Bailey waited. Together they began walking through the snow. Several miles away, tucked into a clearing deep in the woods, a cabin stood beneath heavy icicles and drifts. Smoke curled weakly from its chimney. Inside, a man stirred his coffee in silence. Oliver Grant was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s. His face was angular, weathered by years of sun and sorrow, with a graying beard and deep-set blue eyes that held a 1,000-yard stare. A retired Army medic, he had served 3 tours overseas before returning to a country he no longer recognized, and a home without the wife and son he'd lost in a tragic highway crash. Grief had made him a recluse. He had built his life out in the woods to avoid the world, to live among silence and trees where no one asked questions. Tonight the wind rattled the shutters like a warning. He leaned closer to the window, frowning. Something stirred in the tree line. He set down the mug, picked up the old flashlight from the counter, and stepped into his boots. Outside, the world was awash in blue-white haze. The beam from the flashlight pierced the snow, like a sword illuminating the trail of two figures coming toward the cabin, one tall and four-legged, the other small and staggering. Oliver's breath caught. He stepped forward, waving his light. "Hey!" he shouted. Bailey barked just once. Emily collapsed to her knees. He ran forward, dropping beside her, checking her pulse, her breathing. She was hypothermic, but alive. He scooped her up without hesitation. Bailey followed closely as they entered the cabin. The warmth hit like a wave. Oliver laid Emily gently on the couch, wrapping her in blankets, turning up the heat. He poured water into a tin bowl for the dog without even thinking. Bailey drank quickly, then sat beside the couch, never taking his eyes off Emily. Oliver crouched, brushing hair from the girl's forehead. "You're safe now, kid. You're gonna be okay." Outside, the snow kept falling. The fire crackled steadily in the stone hearth of Oliver Grant's cabin as morning sunlight filtered through a frost-dusted window pane. Outside, the woods surrounding Aspen Creek were cloaked in an eerie stillness, the trees weighed down by last night's snow. A few birds chirped cautiously, their sounds tentative under the weight of winter. The cabin, though modest, radiated a quiet warmth. Its wooden walls held the scent of pine smoke, and something faintly medicinal, remnants of an old life still lingering. Bailey lay curled near the fireplace, his tail flicking gently whenever the small girl beside him moved. The 3-year-old golden retriever had dried off during the night, and his thick coat now shimmered a soft caramel in the firelight. His gaze rarely left the girl's side. He moved with a sense of calm watchfulness, as though guarding something precious and fragile. His black nose occasionally twitched at the faint scent of melting snow still clinging to her boots. Emily Carter, age 7, was now bundled in a thick wool sweater that dwarfed her frame. Her blonde curls had dried into soft waves that framed a pale face marked by uncertainty. Her eyes, a stormy gray, shifted between Bailey and the man who had saved her. She sat at the kitchen table, her small fingers clutching a steaming cup of cocoa. Every so often she glanced at Oliver. Oliver stood by the counter, arms crossed over his flannel shirt. The deep creases on his forehead hadn't softened since sunrise. His once coal-black hair had given way to silver streaks, and the sharp lines of his face were marked not only by age, but by the emotional erosion of loss. A scar curved beneath his left eye, partially hidden by his beard, one of many carried home from war zones far from Montana. Feeling warmer, he asked, his voice a low rumble. Emily nodded silently. She hadn't spoken much since waking up, only offering short replies. But her eyes never left Bailey for long, as though the dog was the only thread tying her to the strange, quiet world she had stumbled into. "What were you doing out in that storm?" he pressed gently. She looked down at her cup. "I was looking for my mom. She didn't come home." He sighed and turned to pour himself some black coffee, letting the question settle between them. From what Oliver had pieced together the night before, Emily had wandered from Sycamore Trailer Park about 5 miles south. To survive that distance in the storm on her own was nothing short of miraculous. That Bailey had found her and guided her to him felt almost unreal. Oliver studied her carefully. She didn't act like other children. He remembered there was something prematurely cautious in the way she moved, a guardedness that only came from having to take care of yourself far too early. A sudden knock at the door startled them both. Emily jumped, nearly spilling her cocoa. Bailey stood at once, ears perked. Oliver stepped to the door and opened it a crack. A man stood outside, bundled in a thick sheriff's department coat, dusted with snow. His name tag read Tanner. "Morning, Grant," he said, pulling his scarf down to reveal a square-jawed face weathered by wind and responsibility. This was Deputy Reed Tanner, early 40s, wiry and methodical, known for being fair but never warm. "You got visitors now." Tanner nodded past Oliver. Oliver followed his gaze and glanced back. Emily had stood halfway from her chair and now stared toward the door with wide, anxious eyes. "Kind of," Oliver said carefully. "Found her in the woods. Dog brought her in. She's from town." Tanner's brow furrowed. "Missing kid. Emily Carter, right." We've been out looking since last night. Her mom reported her missing. Oliver stepped outside and pulled the door mostly shut behind him. Kid says the mom never came home. She went out to look, walked the whole way in that mess. She's lucky to be alive, Tanner muttered. And the dog. Oliver shook his head. No collar, no tags, but smart as hell. Tanner studied Oliver. You keeping her here for now. She's scared to go back. I don't think she trusts that she's safe there. Tanner crossed his arms. That mother's not exactly known for keeping her act together. Sarah Carter's got 2 DUIs and was on probation for a year. But it's not my job to decide if she's a good parent. I'm not asking you to, Oliver replied. I'm just saying, maybe the kid's better off staying here till we sort it out. Tanner hesitated, then pulled a folded slip of paper from his coat. Well, just so you know, they found a note. EMTs picked it up off the floor of their trailer. Figured you should see it. Oliver unfolded the damp paper, the ink smudged but still legible. It was childlike handwriting. If someone finds this, please help. My mom is gone. I'm scared. Bailey is all I have. Oliver's throat tightened. She left that, he asked. Tanner nodded. Yep. Kid must have written it before she went out. Oliver folded the note slowly. She called the dog Bailey. Tanner nodded. You're going to have to bring her in eventually. But I won't rush you. With a brief nod, the deputy stepped off the porch and trudged back to his SUV, the tires crunching over the snow-packed path. Inside, Emily had curled back into Bailey's side, her small hand resting on his back. You named him Bailey Oliver, asked, setting the note on the table. She looked up nervously, then nodded. He came to us a few times before. I thought he was magic. Oliver didn't smile, but his voice softened. Might be. He sat across from her again. I'm not going to make you leave today, okay? But the deputy said, your mom reported you missing. That means we need to figure things out soon. Emily looked down. She doesn't care. She just gets mad when I'm gone too long. She's your mom. She drinks, Emily said bluntly, as if tired of pretending otherwise. And she forgets. One time I stayed in the closet all night, and she didn't even notice. Oliver felt something heavy twist in his chest. Did she ever hit you? No, Emily said, almost surprised. She just leaves. There was a long pause before Oliver said, All right, let's get through today. One thing at a time. That night, after Emily had fallen asleep on the cot beside the fire, and Bailey had curled up next to her, Oliver stared into the flames for a long time. The note Tanner left sat in his palm. He thought of Clara, how gentle she had been with children, of Jake, who would have been just about Emily's age now. The accident had taken them in an instant, but the guilt had lasted years. Bailey raised his head, eyes meeting Oliver's. You brought her here for a reason, didn't you? Oliver muttered. Bailey didn't answer, but his tail gave a quiet thump against the floor. The sun crept lazily over the ridges surrounding Aspen Creek, painting the snow-covered treetops in a soft, amber hue. Inside the cabin, warmth from the fire fought against the creeping chill that returned with every passing night. Oliver Grant stood at the window, coffee mug in hand, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the distant trees swaying gently in the breeze. Emily's quiet breathing behind him reassured him that for now she was still safe, still here. Bailey lay on the braided rug near the hearth, one ear twitching every so often, as if he too never fully slept. That morning, while gathering firewood behind the cabin, Bailey suddenly darted toward a snowbank near the edge of the woods. Oliver looked up, surprised by the dog's sudden urgency. Bailey scratched at the mound, then barked once short, sharp, intentional. Oliver dropped the woodpile and trudged over, kneeling beside him. Just beneath the snow, he spotted something green and nylon. A child's backpack. He pulled it free with some effort. It was worn, one strap fraying, the zipper jammed halfway open. A faded cartoon owl was embroidered on the front. Inside, he found a pair of mittens, a cracked plastic hairbrush, and a folded piece of lined paper. The edges were soggy, but the ink had survived. He read the words slowly, his breath catching. If someone finds her, please help. I can't do this anymore. She deserves better than me. I'm sorry. It was signed hastily, Sarah. Oliver exhaled through his nose, the note trembling slightly in his hand. He looked down at Bailey, who was watching him with that deep, quiet gaze of his. So, this is why she ran, he murmured. Back inside, Emily was sitting at the small table with a sketch pad and colored pencils Oliver had unearthed from a dusty box in the closet. She was drawing Bailey at least a wide, smiling version of him, with exaggerated ears and a fluffy tail. When Oliver entered, she looked up, her face brightening, until she saw the pack in his hand. She went still. "Bailey found this," Oliver said gently. "It's yours, right?" Emily gave a small nod. Her fingers tightened around the red pencil she held. There was a note inside. "From your mom." Her lower lip trembled slightly. "What did it say?" Oliver sat down across from her, placing the paper on the table between them. "She said she's sorry, that she couldn't take care of you anymore." Emily stared at the page for a long time, her gray eyes unreadable. Then she stood and walked to Bailey, dropping to her knees and burying her face in his fur. He leaned into her tail, swishing once, offering comfort without a sound. "I kind of knew," she whispered into his shoulder. "She told me once that I'd be better off with someone else. But I didn't want to believe it." Oliver watched them quietly, feeling a weight press against his chest. He had known abandonment, but not like this. His loss had been sudden, without warning. Emily's had been slow, like a thread, unraveling one tug at a time. That evening, while Emily napped with Bailey curled beside her, Oliver stepped outside and trudged through the snow to a trail that led toward town. He hadn't walked that path in over 5 years. Not since he stopped going to church after Clara and Jake died. Not since he withdrew from the town that had once known him as a good man, and now he assumed remembered him only as a ghost. The trail led to a small chapel nestled at the edge of the creek. It was a white clapboard building with a green roof and stained glass windows depicting deer and mountains instead of saints. It always made Clara laugh, the Montana version of sacred. A group was gathered around a fire pit outside the chapel, part of the community's winter tradition of holding evening hymn sessions and warm social gatherings. Among them was Martha Lane, a petite woman in her 60s with short silver hair and bright blue eyes. She wore a thick knitted scarf and always had a clipboard in hand. She used to run the school library and was known for speaking bluntly and hugging generously. When Oliver approached the edge of the clearing, several heads turned. Conversations faltered. Martha squinted, her breath visible in the cold. "Well, I'll be," she said softly. "Oliver Grant." He gave a short nod. Didn't mean to interrupt. Martha walked toward him with calm authority, snow crunching under her boots. "You're not interrupting anything we don't want interrupted. I was beginning to wonder if I'd ever see you off your land again." "I've got a kid in my cabin," he said simply. "She's not mine, but she needs help." Martha raised an eyebrow. "Come inside, warm up. Then you can tell me everything." They sat together on a bench inside the chapel while he recounted what had happened. He didn't share everything, but enough. Martha listened without judgment, only nodding at the right moments. "Bring her by the chapel," she said finally. "Not for a sermon, just to drink a little hot cocoa and maybe listen to some music. It's not a service, no pressure." Oliver gave a tight smile. "I'll ask her." He returned home late the night, deep and silent. Emily was awake, sitting by the window, staring out into the dark. Bailey lay beside her, alert, but relaxed. "You went somewhere," she said softly. "I did. To the chapel in town." She blinked. "Do you believe in God?" "I believe in trying," he said after a moment. "Sometimes that's enough." He knelt beside her, placing a small hand-knitted mitten on the table, something Martha had insisted he bring back for her. "They asked if you wanted to come next time, just to drink a little cocoa. Maybe hear some songs. Nothing big." Emily was quiet, then nodded once. As they both turned back toward the fire, Bailey rose and moved between them, his golden body pressing into their legs like a bridge. The snow began to melt in patches as a milder wind swept through Aspen Creek, loosening the winter's grip, though the trees still stood bare and watchful. The paths that had been buried for weeks started to peek through under Bailey's careful steps. Early that morning, Emily stood by the front door of the cabin, her boots on arms tucked into the sleeves of Oliver's oversized flannel jacket. Her face was solemn but resolute. "I want to try," she said, "to find her." Oliver stood a few feet away, holding a thermos of coffee, his breath curling in the chilly air. He looked at her, and then at Bailey, who had already stationed himself beside her like a golden sentinel. The dog's fur caught the morning light, and his dark eyes were fixed on Oliver, with something close to expectation. "All right," Oliver said quietly, "but if we do this, we do it smart." He packed a small bag with supplies, flashlights, water, 2 peanut butter sandwiches, a first aid kit, and a flare gun he hadn't used since his last winter hike years ago. Emily added her sketchbook just in case, she said. Bailey simply waited tail, sweeping slowly, calmly. They started at the edge of Sycamore Trailer Park, the place Emily had left behind in the storm. It was a scattered cluster of outdated trailers and broken mailboxes, the kind of place where insulation peeled from corners and satellite dishes pointed nowhere. Oliver parked his truck just outside the frozen dirt lot and led Emily through the rows of weather-worn homes. "Number 16, she said softly, pointing to a faded blue trailer with a missing front step and a crooked screen door. That was ours. They approached slowly. The door creaked open at Oliver's knock. No answer. The inside smelled of dust, old beer, and loneliness. Empty bottles sat on the counter like forgotten promises. On the couch, a threadbare coat lay crumpled, and an ashtray overflowed with lipstick-marked cigarettes. Emily stepped inside, slowly, Bailey following at her heel. Her eyes scanned the space with practiced detachment. "She hasn't been here in days," she said. Oliver searched the small kitchen and found a torn note pinned under a can of soup on the counter. "I messed up again. I just needed a few days to clear my head. I'll be back. Don't be mad, Em." "Mom," he handed the note to Emily. She read it silently, then folded it without expression and slid it into her pocket. "She always does this," she murmured. "Where would she go?" Oliver asked gently. Emily shrugged. Sometimes she'd sleep in the woods behind the trailer. She said trees don't judge her. That gave Oliver pause. They headed into the forest, the one behind the trailer park, where trails twisted and thinned like memory. Bailey took the lead, his movement suddenly sharper, more alert. The snow here was deeper, untouched by footsteps. After an hour, they found remnants of a camp, an old blanket, a burned-out fire pit, and a plastic bottle half filled with frozen water. Then something more, a torn scarf snagged on a branch. Emily picked it up with a sharp intake of breath. "It's hers." Oliver's jaw tightened. She was here. Bailey circled the area, nose to the ground, then barked twice and headed east. They followed. Along the trail, the forest thickened. Emily struggled with a root and nearly fell, but Oliver caught her by the arm. "Careful." They walked in silence until they reached a frozen stream. On the far side, a noise broke through the stillness, a strange pained sound. Oliver motioned for Emily to stay back. He crossed the icy water and crouched near a thicket. There, caught in a snarl of wire fencing, was a young deer, its hind leg twisted, its body trembling. Bailey stayed back, sensing the animal's distress. Emily stepped forward carefully. "He's hurt." Oliver examined the leg. The wire was rusty, likely left by old property lines or hunters. He looked up and saw a cabin in the distance, smaller than his, worn down with a sagging roof. Someone used to live here. "Can we help it?" Emily asked, kneeling beside the deer. Oliver took out a multi-tool and gently worked to free the wire. It took time and patience, but eventually the deer pulled away with a panicked grunt and limped off into the brush. Emily watched it disappear. "He's gonna be okay, right, I think." "So," Oliver said. She was quiet a moment. He looked scared. "But he didn't fight us. Sometimes when you're really scared, you stop fighting altogether," he replied, then almost to himself. "Or sometimes you don't even know someone's trying to help." As they turned back toward the trail, Bailey barked again, this time sharply. Ahead, nestled between fallen branches and a large pine trunk, was a shape. Oliver ran forward. Lying there was a woman, curled beneath a damp sleeping bag, shivering violently. Her blonde hair was tangled, her lips pale. Her hands clutched a flask that had long since run dry. "Sarah," Oliver said under his breath. Sarah Carter was a tall, thin woman in her mid-30s. Her once pretty features were now drawn and hollowed. Her skin had the waxy pallor of exhaustion and withdrawal. She wore layers of mismatched clothing, none of them enough for the weather, and her fingers were covered in small cuts. She stirred slightly at the sound of his voice, but didn't fully wake. Emily froze, her eyes wide, caught between fear and longing. "Mom?" Oliver knelt and checked Sarah's pulse, weak but present. "She's alive, but we need to move fast." They built a makeshift sled from fallen branches in Oliver's coat. He wrapped Sarah inside it and tied the bundle to Bailey's harness. The dog pulled with surprising strength, step by determined step, as they made their way slowly back toward the truck. It took nearly 2 hours to get her to the medical clinic in town. Nurse Linda Marquez, a woman in her early 40s with warm brown skin, close-cropped hair, and a calm demeanor, honed by years and urgent care, received them. She worked quickly with the attending doctor, checking Sarah's vitals and hooking up fluids. "She's hypothermic and dehydrated," Linda said. "But she'll make it?" Emily stood outside the exam room, gripping Bailey's fur, her expression unreadable. Oliver sat beside her. "You did good today." She shook her head. "I didn't save her. You did. You led us to her. That's something." Bailey looked up, his tail tapping softly against the floor. The sky above Aspen Creek darkened to a leaden gray, the kind of sky that pressed low against the world and held its breath before something unforgiving. The forecast had predicted only flurries, but in Montana, nature made its own rules. Oliver sensed it before the radio did the sudden hush in the air, the way even the wind paused. He stood on the porch of the cabin, coffee in hand, his eyes scanning the tree line. Inside, Emily was carefully placing a knit cap over her mother's head. Sarah Carter had been discharged from the clinic earlier that morning, stabilized but weakened. She moved slowly, her body still brittle from exposure, and her voice came and went in hoarse whispers. Her frame was long and lanky, her cheeks hollowed with dirty blonde hair that now hung in damp strands despite Emily's efforts to brush it. Sarah's eyes, pale blue and deeply tired, avoided mirrors. Years of hardship and addiction had carved invisible lines into her demeanor, defensive, ashamed, and always on edge. "I don't think this is a good idea," Sarah murmured, watching Emily pack the last of their lunch into a paper bag. "It's just a short walk," Emily replied, zipping up her coat. "We won't go far." Bailey stood by the door, tail still, as if already sensing what was coming. Oliver walked back in, wiping melted snow from his jacket. "If we go," he said, "we go light and turn back early." No one plays hero. The plan was simple: to take a walk through the ridge trails north of the cabin, hoping the fresh air and stillness might help Sarah, who had remained tense and silent since waking up. Oliver knew trauma could haunt a person, cling to their shoulders like wet snow. He also knew that sometimes movement helped more than medicine. The four of them, Oliver, Emily, Sarah, and Bailey, stepped into the woods by mid-morning, trudging through a narrow, half-visible path under fir trees dusted in white. For a while, it was peaceful. Sarah kept her eyes down, avoiding Emily's gaze, and Emily didn't push. Bailey moved ahead, pausing occasionally to look back, checking on each of them in turn, like a shepherd counting sheep. They had gone no more than 2 miles when the mountain growled. It was faint at first, a low rumble like distant thunder. Oliver's head snapped up. "Did you hear that?" Bailey barked once, sharp, alarmed. Then came the crack, high and unnatural, like the snapping of the world's spine. Snow exploded from the ridge above them, a white wall descending in slow, horrifying silence before the sound truly hit. "Avalanche!" Oliver shouted. He grabbed Emily, pulling her behind a boulder, while Bailey circled back and placed himself in front of them. Sarah stumbled, frozen in panic, her knees buckling beneath her. The snow slammed down like a tidal wave, ripping branches, dislodging trees, and burying the trail in moments. When it passed, everything was still again, but changed. They were trapped. A massive drift of snow now blocked the path behind them. The trail ahead disappeared into debris and white chaos. Sarah sat against a tree, shaking. "I can't," she gasped. "I can't breathe." Oliver knelt beside her. "You're okay. We're all okay. But we can't go back the way we came." Bailey paced the edge of the collapsed snow wall, nose down, sniffing tail, rigid. Then he barked twice and trotted east into the woods. He found something, Emily said. "I'm not leaving that dog," Oliver muttered, helping Sarah to her feet. "Come on." The going was rough. Fallen branches, hidden rocks, and unstable snow made each step cautious and exhausting. Sarah struggled the most, but Oliver kept her upright with one arm, while Bailey scouted ahead, pausing and waiting each time they slowed. The dog's instincts were uncanny. He seemed to know which slopes to avoid, which turns were safer. They followed him for over an hour until a narrow pass opened beneath a rocky arch. Beyond it, the trees thinned and the familiar edge of the cabin's east clearing came into view. "We made it," Emily whispered. Bailey bounded forward, tail wagging, and let out a long, proud bark. Oliver exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Remind me to give that dog a steak." Sarah leaned on him, too exhausted to speak. But there was something new in her eyes as she looked at Bailey, not fear or doubt, but something close to reverence. Later that afternoon, back at the cabin, Oliver received a radio call. The local fire chief was calling for help. An elderly man named Elias Rutherford, who lived alone near the southern creek, hadn't shown up to pick up his medication. The clinic couldn't reach him. With the roads barely cleared and ambulances delayed, they needed someone nearby to check. Oliver paused. The old Oliver might have ignored the call, but this time he looked at Bailey, then at Emily and Sarah, both resting near the fire. "I'll go," he said. Emily looked up. "Want us to come?" He shook his head. "Not this time." He took the truck as far as the creek trail would allow, then hiked the rest of the way on foot. The snow was deep, but the sky had cleared. Bailey, of course, insisted on coming. When they reached Elias's cabin, the door was unlocked. The inside smelled of soup and old paper. Elias lay crumpled near the wood stove, his face pale, eyes half-lidded. A stroke Oliver guessed he remembered the signs. Working quickly, he rolled the old man onto a blanket and positioned him in the recovery pose. He used the emergency radio in Elias's cabin to call for medics, then kept the man warm until help arrived. Bailey lay at Elias's feet the whole time, unmoving. When the paramedics came, one of them, a young woman with freckles and cropped red hair, looked at Oliver and said, "You probably saved his life." Oliver nodded once. "Glad I was close." Back at the cabin that night, Oliver sat on the porch steps with Bailey beside him. The stars were out sharp and cold, the sky unmarred. Inside, Emily read aloud from a book she'd found in Oliver's small library, her voice faint through the window. Sarah dozed beside the fire. Bailey rested his head against Oliver's thigh. "You did good today," Oliver said softly. Bailey blinked once slowly and exhaled a warm breath into the night. Snowmelt had begun trickling through the woods around Aspen Creek, threading tiny rivulets between roots and stones, like the earth exhaling after a long, hard breath. The days were still cold, but the light lingered longer. Inside Oliver's cabin, that change was felt in small things: muddy boots at the door instead of frozen ones, window panes clear of frost, and the faint scent of pine returning with the thaw. Sarah Carter sat by the fire with a cup of tea cradled in both hands. Her posture was still guarded, but she no longer recoiled from warmth, literal or emotional. The hollows beneath her eyes had softened slightly, and her frame, though still thin, carried less of a tremor. She wore a borrowed wool sweater over thermal leggings, her hair pulled into a low, clumsy bun. It was the first time Oliver had seen her brush it without being asked. Emily, seated cross-legged nearby, colored quietly in her sketchbook. She glanced up occasionally as if checking that her mother was still there, not just physically, but truly present. Bailey lay between them, head resting on his paws, golden fur, absorbing the heat of the fire. "Do you think I can really fix this?" Sarah asked suddenly, her voice hoarse but steadier than it had been in weeks. Oliver, leaning against the doorframe, folded his arms. "I think wanting to is the first step. The rest is about showing up. Every day." Sarah gave a small, bitter laugh. "I used to be good at disappearing, even from myself." "You're not the only one," Oliver said, his gaze distant. Later that week, he drove into town, not for supplies, but for something else. At the community center, a modest wooden building near the chapel, a flyer had caught his eye. It read, "Veterans Peer Group, Wednesday nights at 6 p.m. Healing starts with being heard." He hadn't walked into anything resembling a group meeting in over 6 years. Not since the funerals. Not since the silence became his comfort and his prison. But this time, he parked the truck, shut off the engine, and walked in. Inside, a circle of folding chairs surrounded a coffee urn and a tray of dry cookies. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet. There were only 5 people there so far, all men, most in their 40s to 60s. One had a prosthetic leg. Another wore a navy cap and rubbed his hands together like he couldn't quite stay still. A woman stood at the head of the circle. Her name was Delilah D. Martin, a short, broad-shouldered Army veteran with dark skin, close-cropped salt and pepper hair, and a voice that was firm without being hard. She wore a denim shirt tucked into faded jeans and had a large ring on one hand that she fidgeted with when others spoke. Her presence was quiet but grounding. "New face," D said, gesturing to an empty chair. "We don't bite." Oliver gave a curt nod and sat. The others nodded in silent acknowledgement. There was no pressure, no introductions demanded. Just space. The session began with D saying a few words about guilt, the invisible kind that lingered like shrapnel in the soul. Oliver didn't speak at first. He listened, and when one man recounted waking up screaming from dreams of a convoy gone wrong, Oliver understood it intimately. By the end of the meeting, he hadn't said more than a dozen words, but Dee handed him a folded piece of paper on his way out. It read, "You showed up. That counts. D." When he returned to the cabin, Emily was asleep on the couch, a blanket half fallen to the floor. Sarah was washing dishes, slow and methodical. "How was town?" she asked, not turning around. He hesitated. "Good. I stopped by the center. Veterans group." Sarah paused, dish in hand. Did it help? He considered that, then answered honestly. It might. The next morning brought more change. Emily had begun taking short walks with Bailey without needing Oliver to accompany them. He still watched from the porch, but the way she stood straighter, talked to the dog in full sentences, and laughed out loud without flinching made his chest ache in the best way. Sarah began journaling, not just lists of things to do or apologies to herself, but real thoughts, hopes, doubts. Her voice returned in her writing before it returned in conversation. Then, one afternoon, while gathering wood near the clearing, Sarah turned to Oliver. "I want to stay clean," she said, eyes steady. "But I don't trust myself without help. Is there a program in town?" He nodded. "There is. Martha can help get you in. It's faith-based, but they've got real counselors too." Sarah exhaled. "I think I'm ready." That evening, Sarah sat down beside Emily and for the first time held both of her daughter's hands in hers. "I'm sorry," she said, not rushing the words, "for everything. I want to try, not just for you, for me too." Emily didn't say anything right away, but she leaned forward, wrapping her arms around her mother's waist. Bailey, lying nearby, lifted his head and thumped his tail twice before resting it again. Oliver watched the scene from the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of tea instead of coffee. For the first time in years, his house felt not just full, but alive. The wind carried the scent of thawing earth and pine as spring crept into Aspen Creek. Snowdrifts shrank back into shadows, streams bubbled with fresh meltwater, and the trees' once gaunt silhouettes showed soft hints of green at their tips. The transformation was slow, almost reverent, and inside Oliver Grant's cabin, a similar kind of shift had taken root. Emily sat on the porch steps beside Bailey, her sketchpad resting on her knees. She was now 8, though it was hard to tell when her eyes still held the caution of someone older, someone who had seen too much. But there was light there, too. She laughed more freely now, often at Bailey's silly antics, or at Oliver's attempts at burnt pancakes. She still carried a quietness with her, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was thoughtful, gentle, intentional. Bailey, now fully at ease in his role as protector and companion, had become something of a legend in the area. His thick golden coat gleamed in the sun, and the scar on his foreleg left from one of their first treks in the woods was a silent reminder of what he had overcome. At the local chapel, children often greeted him by name, slipping him treats or drawing pictures of him that now decorated the community board. Inside the cabin, Sarah Carter leaned over the kitchen counter, scribbling numbers into a budget notebook. Her hair was trimmed, her face fuller, and though her eyes still betrayed a long history of exhaustion, they now held focus. She was in her 6th week of outpatient recovery. Every morning, she walked to the chapel, where she volunteered to help serve meals or fold clothing donations. Every night, she wrote a single sentence in a journal Emily had given her. "Today I stayed." Oliver sat across the room, reading over a worn stack of typewritten pages. His manuscript, nearly complete, had taken form slowly over months of early dawns and sleepless nights. The title Golden Heart wasn't just about the dog that had led a lost child into his arms. It was about second chances, about how a broken man, a forgotten child, and a guilt-ridden mother had found their way through the dark together. In the opening chapter, he had written, "Not all rescues start with sirens. Some begin with paw prints in the snow." He had debated whether to submit it to a publisher. It wasn't for fame. It was for the people like him, like Sarah, who needed a reminder that broken didn't mean beyond repair. That afternoon, they drove into town together for a court appointment. Emily had pressed her dress carefully that morning, blue with white daisies. Sarah wore clean jeans and a soft blouse. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the collar. The courtroom in Helena wasn't grand, just a plain beige room with humming lights and worn carpets. Judge Margaret Hollis, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair, pulled into a bun, and glasses perched low on her nose, presided with a calm, thoughtful presence. She had read the reports, seen the letters of recommendation, and reviewed the counselor's notes. Oliver Grant, she said, glancing over her glasses. You're here today to petition for legal guardianship of Emily Carter. Yes, Your Honor, and Sarah Carter. The judge continued, turning to the woman beside him. You are voluntarily signing consent. Sarah stood slowly. Yes, ma'am, I'm not giving her away. I'm giving her stability. Something I couldn't provide. But now I can stay close and rebuild from there? Judge Hollis nodded once, then she turned to Emily. And what about you, sweetheart? Are you okay with this? Emily stood on her toes and whispered something to Oliver, who smiled gently and gave a little nod. She says she already feels like he's her dad, Oliver said. The judge blinked slowly and smiled. Then let's make it official. The gavel came down with a soft knock. It echoed gently in Oliver's chest. On the way back, they stopped by the chapel. Martha Lane had been waiting outside with a small box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a collar engraved not with Bailey's name, but with the phrase property of the Golden Heart family. Below that it read, Emily, Sarah, Oliver, and Bailey. Martha smiled as Bailey nuzzled her coat pockets for cookies. Told you this town still had room for miracles. The following month, Oliver stood at a podium in a small community center just outside Billings. Behind him, a banner read, Veterans' Right to Heal, Guest Author Series. He wore a charcoal blazer over his usual flannel, looking slightly uncomfortable but proud. Dee Martin, his support group leader, sat in the front row, arms crossed and smiling faintly. He read excerpts from his book hands, only trembling once. When he reached the passage where Emily had first walked into his life, he paused. Bailey, sitting near his feet, tilted his head and let out a soft huff, as if waiting for the next line. And that's when I realized, Oliver said to the room, some family isn't made by blood. It's made by choice, and sometimes by a golden retriever. Laughter and applause followed. Later during book signings, an older man in a battered military jacket leaned in and whispered, Thanks for reminding us, it's not too late. Oliver nodded, placing a hand over the man's. It never is. Back in Aspen Creek, the cabin had changed too. A second bedroom had been added. The old shed out back was now a reading nook with beanbags and shelves. Emily's artwork covered the refrigerator. Sarah was taking courses online in counseling, and Bailey remained a constant. At sunset, Emily sat with Oliver by the stream. She leaned against him, hair braided down her back, and asked, Do you think people really change? Oliver wrapped an arm around her shoulders. No doubt in my mind. Bailey, standing in the shallows, barked joyfully as a dragonfly danced above the water. The sky blushed orange and gold. And just like that, a new day began, shaped by all the ones they had survived. The snow returned to Aspen Creek in whispers, drifting silently across rooftops and settling into the folds of the land like a comforting quilt. By early December, the town had transformed into a living postcard, frosted windows wreaths on every door and strings of soft yellow lights curling around fence posts and lamp posts like gentle promises. It was the first real winter in years that didn't feel heavy on Oliver Grant's shoulders. Inside the cabin, Emily stood on a wooden stool beside the tree, carefully placing a hand-painted ornament onto a branch. The tree itself was tall and uneven, cut from the edge of their property, with Bailey circling it like a proud scout. Ornaments of every kind adorned its limbs. Some were from Martha Lane's church fair, others handmade by Emily, and one shaped like a golden paw print gleamed near the top. Bailey lay by the hearth, his chin resting on his front paws, eyes watching the scene as if it were all staged for him. At 5 years old now, his muzzle had just begun to silver, but his spirit hadn't dimmed. If anything, he carried himself with even more pride, aware of the role he'd come to play, not only in this home, but in the hearts of an entire town. Sarah, wearing a forest green sweater and a soft burgundy scarf, was decorating sugar cookies at the kitchen counter. She looked healthier than she had in years, her figure still slender, but no longer brittle. Her once nervous energy had mellowed into something quietly determined. Every Friday, she now led a peer support group for women in recovery at the community center. Her presence had gone from fragile to foundational. Oliver entered from outside, brushing snow off his shoulders. He wore his usual flannel beneath a gray wool coat, but now it was paired with a scarf Emily had knit clumsily lovingly. They've started setting up the booths in town, he said, shaking the snow from his boots. The winter festival's going up fast. Did they put up the sign? Emily asked, eyes sparkling. They did, Oliver said. And your name's on the volunteer list, Hot Cocoa Station. She beamed. Can Bailey come? Oliver looked down at the golden retriever, who wagged his tail lazily in reply. Pretty sure he's the main attraction. That evening, the three of them, plus one golden hero, walked to town. The path had been lit by strings of fairy lights that swayed gently between the trees, casting a golden hue on the snow below. The center of Aspen Creek had been transformed. Children ran between candy-striped booths, carolers in knit hats sang near the bonfire, and an enormous tree stood at the square, its lights twinkling against the dusky sky. Mayor Hank Whitaker, a jovial man in his 60s, with a thick white beard and a laugh that could rival any Santa, stood on the main stage. His red parka stretched slightly at the buttons, and his voice boomed through the speakers. Now, before we light the tree, he said we have someone very special to recognize. Emily looked up at Oliver, confused. Bailey sat beside her, ears perked. This town has had its share of tough winters, the mayor continued, but sometimes light comes in unexpected forms. Sometimes it has 4 legs, a wagging tail, and a heart of gold. A cheer rippled through the crowd. This year's Little Hero Award goes to a dog who helped bring a family back together and reminded us all what love looks like in its purest form. Bailey, come on up here, boy. Emily gasped, eyes wide. Bailey, that's you. The crowd parted as Bailey trotted forward, tail wagging modestly as if unsure what all the fuss was about. Oliver gave a gentle nudge, and Bailey jumped up on the small stage with an easy grace. Mayor Whitaker bent and slipped a ribbon medal around his neck. To Bailey, Aspen Creek's golden heart. Applause rang out, mixed with laughter and a few tears. Children clapped, parents nodded knowingly, and somewhere in the front row, Martha Lane wiped her eyes behind her thick glasses. After the ceremony, with hot cocoa in hand and cookies shared between them, Oliver lifted Emily into his arms so she could see over the heads of the crowd. Music drifted through the air, violins, soft piano, and the distant echo of bells. She leaned in and whispered into his ear, her voice small but certain. Merry Christmas, Dad. Oliver froze for a heartbeat, then felt something tighten and then release inside his chest. He held her close. Merry Christmas, sweetheart. Back at the cabin that night, the tree lights glowed softly in the corner. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, with Bailey curled up beside her. Sarah sipped peppermint tea at the table, smiling as she reread a postcard from a friend in the recovery group. Oliver stepped out onto the porch. The snow was still falling lightly, casting a hush over the world. He stood with hands in his coat pockets, watching the distant ridge where so much of this story had begun. It amazed him still how loss had led to love, how broken things, when held with care, could become beautiful again. Behind him, the warmth of home pulsed gently like a heartbeat. Sometimes it's not the big gestures that change a life, but the quiet choice to stay, to forgive, to love again. Bailey didn't speak, but his loyalty led a lost girl home and gave a broken man the courage to hope. Maybe you've met someone like that, a person, a pet, a moment of unexpected love that saved you. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs a little light. Comment below. Have you ever been found by a love you didn't expect? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where hope always finds a way.